Our discussion today will focus on two films, Fatal Attraction and Gone Girl. We'll kick off with Fatal Attraction. So we have a group of clinicians in the room who have observed various behaviors of several characters. Is there any particular character or scene you'd like to further discuss?
I can jump into this.
Go for it.
I guess, for one of the scenes that stuck out to me was the one where, like, after the weekends that I think I can remember his name.
Dan?
Dan and Alex have their affair, and he says that they won't be continuing their relationship since he's already married. I guess just the reaction Alex had to that was rather extreme, and then brought up, I guess, some question of like personality disorder in my mind. Just based on like how extreme that reaction was.
Remind me, where was that scene set?
I believe it was in her apartment.
Okay, so it was the apartment scene, all right. All right, so let's kind of discuss the apartment scene in a couple of steps. The first of which would be, I think, parallel to what I would hope everyone in here would think when any person comes to you for help in any clinical setting, and that is, it is completely normal until there's evidence to the contrary, and then it is not. So, and I think this seems a great example because if you interviewed 100 people in terms of how they would feel in that situation, I'm guessing around 100 is going to say, I share Alex's feelings. And therefore it's completely normal, well within a normal range of behavior. On the other hand, I think that given what we see prior to, and certainly after, subsequent to that particular scene, we can then look back and interpret the behavior in a greater context. And especially if anybody's here geeked out and read the backstory, there is enormous context. So what might first be viewed and interpreted as quote unquote normal is perhaps abnormal and part of a psychopathology. Right? So that's, I think, the first teaching point. What else did anyone observe as part of that scene that you think either could contribute to our defining what it is that actually happened, or maybe even including as part of that constellation of symptoms? Well, let me ask you this. If Alex were to present to you following that apartment scene, what might be her chief complaint? What behavior do we want to start with that might lend to her coming to clinical attention?
Worried about SI, like suicide. Future plans.
Right. So we're going to manipulate the actual film at this point and say that instead of spending the rest of the day with her and then kissing her goodbye and leaving the apartment, Dan actually takes her to the nearest emergency department that you are now part of your psych clerkship taking call. Right. And she presents with what appears to have been a suicide attempt. And then per whether it's Alex, Dan, or some combination of, you then get filled in about the HPI, which is the plot of this movie, at least up to that point. What else might be part of the HPI that you think is worthy of further investigation? So we're still sticking with the apartment scene and maybe even things prior to. So let's not go past that scene just yet. But let's talk about the HPI. What else do we have?
Right before she, really was in the secondary behavior, there's kind of like a push and pull moment where, they're still in bed. She's saying, I gotta go. Like, she's saying, no, please stay. And in this moment, she fully wants him to stay. She's pulling, but then all of a sudden, once he's persistent on like leaving, she actually pushes him like physically. So there's kind of like a moment of, if you're not gonna do what I want, then I'm going to push you away. And then I kind of.
Let's pause for that, because I think you uncovered something that we can't dismiss. And let's say hypothetically that upon further questioning, we recognize that this does not happen in isolation, that this particular character, we'll call her Alex, has demonstrated what you exactly just described on several prior occasions. What might you attribute this to? What's going on here?
More of a splitting,
A little bit?
Yeah, splitting, the ability to, the extent that like choose, one hot and cold, kind of.
Kind of?
For sure.
Yes, exactly what's going on here. All right, so, and of course, I think the follow-up question would be to kind of delve into whether or not splitting has informed this person's feelings and behavior in the past beyond what we visualize here, which is, again, that idealization with rapid devaluation, right? Please get out of here. The other part of this that I don't want to dismiss is the anger. Now, again, I think on the surface, perfectly normal. Again, if we polled 100 people, I think all of us could agree we'd be pretty angry too. But now in the context of a suicidal gesture, mood lability, we should include the anger here too, even if we're going to dismiss it later. It's just part of what would be state anxiety. That is, it's state dependent. It's the result of the actual scene itself than it is the personality of the individual in the scene. But we should note that. Is the anger at all associated with the suicidal gesture? And if so, how? Asked differently, what are the two characteristic defense mechanisms that literally define borderline personality disorder? One of which you already gave me, splitting. There are two others. Number two, which is actually a diagnostic criterion, is dissociation. And I'll just point you to the scene again, post-rejection, where he doesn't show up to pick her up for the ballet. And she just sits dissociated in that room, light on, light off, right? For minutes on end. But that scene interplayed with him bowling, totally blowing her off and having a grand old time with his friends, right? Dissociation. Dissociation is the defense mechanism. Right? It's both a diagnostic criteria for borderline personality as well as a defense mechanism. That's number two. Number three, very characteristic of individuals with borderline, is passive aggression, defined as the inward turning of a nihilistic impulse, for example, anger. Right? When anger is turned inward, we can see someone like Alex cut her wrists. Right? So passive aggression is thought to underlie the suicidal gestures that are defining of, aka a clinical criterion of borderline personality disorder. Right? Anger itself is also a diagnostic criteria.
Would denial, would that fall under one of those three that you just said?
No, it'd be extra. So not necessarily part of what we're discussing, and not necessarily part of a criteria set, but I don't think any of us would dismiss that denial doesn't play a role in individuals with mental illness in general, certainly borderline as depicted in this movie in particular. So yes, but not necessarily in that diagnostic criteria set. The three quote unquote characteristic defenses that appear in this criteria set include dissociation, splitting, and passive aggression. With dissociation actually being a clinical criteria for defining the illness, and passive aggression related to the suicidal gestures, and splitting related to the mood lability and affectual instability that defines borderline. All of which I think, again, are very well portrayed, albeit perhaps dramatically and over the top in this character. And you heard me mention a couple of other things. I did mention that anger itself is a diagnostic criteria. And so is abandonment issues, which of course we've mentioned now 3 times, right? Well, it's 2, and we're about to get to another one. So we see her decompensate after perceived or actual abandonment. All right. Anything else from this particular scene? Past psychiatric history, again, only information up to this point. I don't want to go beyond this point just yet. Other aspects of this movie, between the opening credits and that apartment scene, that you would like to bring up for discussion, AKA would be part of Alex's HPI as she presented to you.
I don't think we actually get to see this part, but definitely the history of past relationships, relationships with family and friends. Is she able to maintain any kind of relationship? It seems like Dan at some point says, you need to see this through, et cetera, et cetera. I'd share the scene as like this. What a boyfriend. She seemed to be like, no, there's nothing wrong with you. Yeah, so I think maybe those things. Oh, maybe even substance use.
When it comes to past relationships, and again, interpersonal dysfunction is part of the definition of borderline. So here's yet another one. What evidence beyond what we're seeing her go through with Dan is there that she actually does have these deficits in interpersonal functioning? There's two that both of which are prior to that scene, although one isn't verified until after that apartment scene.
I maybe don't remember this entirely correctly, but when he was snooping through her apartment, and found like the newspaper with, I guess the obituary of some man, I assume was maybe potentially a previous relationship of hers who passed away.
It was a previous relationship, it was her father. Yeah, and that links to the Central Park scene, where after Dan plays a practical joke on her, she admonishes him, saying that my father died of a heart attack. I discovered the body. Just kidding. Only to find out that she wasn't kidding. Right, so that is one of those that, although it was introduced prior to the apartment scene, is validated, verified post that scene. And then there's one other that's a little subtler, but now that everything's shaping up the way it is, and there are certain people in this room that are identifying deficits in interpersonal communication and functioning, we have to go back and look at it a little closer and realize there might be much more to the story here, pun intended. How does, after, well, I shouldn't say, after the first time they meet at the mixer, how does Dan reconnect with Alex? Describe to me what's going on. I mean, anytime I get called in on a Saturday, I want to know what's going on, right? In fact, my name's not on that call list, and I'm working on a Saturday. I'm gonna want to know a little bit more detail, and if anybody is on call with me, I'm sure you will have the same mindset as to Tobia. What are we doing here? What are they doing there?
So it sounded to me that there was some, like, they were publishing a book or something, and there was a question, like a legal question of whether it was based on some politician of a different state, and whether there was any truth to like there being an affair.
And again, I think for the most part, I mean, this is the first time watching this movie. I'm a little shocked that they're in the same room together and realizing, oh, this is not going to turn out all that great. I don't think it's going to turn out as bad as it winds up ending. But all of a sudden you realize this is, boy, an unfortunate chance encounter. And I miss the dialogue. What is it that Durden in the original and then the movie adaptation is communicating to us here? Who is the person in the book who had the affair with the senator? Because they ask Alex.
Oh, a reporter.
Who's unnamed. And they ask, do your sources tell you that A or B? And she says, I have it on good word that, and she provides the answer, who is the person who had the affair? This is her tell-all book. Yeah, which is again supportive of what we now becoming to recognize, and that there's a history of impulsivity and interpersonal dysfunction, not only between her and her dad, not only between current day, her and her dad surrogate, AKA Dan, but at least one father figure, senator, an individual who she would look up to, who she would deem to be subordinate to, AKA another father figure, and that's a state senator. Right, so you could check the box for interpersonal dysfunction, as well as perhaps even impulsivity. And if you had any question about impulsivity, then let's go right from that meeting to the elevator scene and understand what happened, right? Because now she seems rather impulsive too. Not that Dan isn't, right? He's just as impulsive. And I will say this about Dan, while he is just as impulsive here, it's difficult to come up with a diagnosis for him because number one, it's a little bit more of a reach because his character just isn't as rich as that of Alex Forrest. And when you do come up with a diagnosis, it almost seems like you're making excuses for what he does. And there is no excuse for what he does. In the character that has a mental illness, not to use the word excuse, but we can understand why she behaves the way she does, especially when you understand the backstory. What is the backstory for those of you who have geeked out and have deep dived this film? Early childhood sexual abuse at the hands of her father. Right, that's actually scripted. It did not make the actual cut of the film. However, Glenn Close has given multiple interviews about the character of Alex Forrest, and that is part of her character development, character's history. And she's a victim of incest, which of course would be consistent. Somebody did their homework and look in medical text about the etiology of borderline personality disorder. We mentioned the Central Park scene where we're first introduced to her dad. And we mentioned the scene in which Dan breaks into her apartment, finds that scrapbook, further clarifying her relationship with her father and wondering why would it be that she actually lied the way she did. Those scenes are connected by 37 minutes. There I geeked out. I actually timed it. And the reason why I timed it is because within those 37 minutes, this film captures in the character of Alex Forrest every single diagnostic criteria for borderline personality disorder. She doesn't miss a single one. And we already named, I think, 6 or 7. But there's 10 total. So they're all there. All right. So there may not be arguably a better depiction of borderline than Dearden's Alex Forrest in Fatal Attraction. What else about this character? What else does she do that concerns, disturbs, otherwise requires you to investigate from the behavioral medicine perspective?
It stalks.
She does stalk him. Mhm.
Kills the rabbit.
She kills the, so what about that? I mean, and here I'm coming from a much more symbolic perspective that the rabbit died. You guys are way too young to recognize this, but maybe your mom or dad told you about this, especially going into medicine, the history of the rabbit test. No, huh? So, and there's actually a film that called Rabbit Test starring Dustin Hoffman. If anyone's interested, I wouldn't recommend it. I think what we're about to discuss probably is going to suffice, but just in case you think I might be a little off here, Rabbit Test starring Dustin Hoffman. There was a office-based test back in the 70s called the Rabbit Test that was a pregnancy test. The idea here would be that the rabbit was injected with the woman's serum. And then the rabbit was euthanized and their ovaries were actually, what's the word I'm looking for, reviewed or sent to a lab. And if there were high levels of beta HCG, congratulations, you got that phone call, you were pregnant. Right. Now, many people misinterpreted this test that you injected the rabbit and if it died, you were pregnant, and if it lived, you weren't. And that was what the movie was based on, the misinterpretation of the test, because in this comedy starring Dustin Hoffman, he went into his primary care physician's office for a routine physical, and his blood work got mixed up with a pregnant woman's blood work, and he was called, congratulations, the rabbit guy. And the rest of the movie is a comedy about how he deals with being pregnant. Right, the rabbit test. Right. Alex killing that bunny is symbolic. There's no coincidence that the writer producer used the rabbit as her pet. Right, the rabbit died, which links to the scene in which she tells Dan that she's pregnant. Remember, in that scene, he's rejected her yet again, and he is walking away, and she blurts out, "I'm pregnant." Now, I think on the surface, many of us, especially because she meets multiple criteria for borderline personality, and by that time she may have hit all 10, realize that this may be manipulation and she may not be pregnant at all. And that's a question. Do you really think Alex Forrest was pregnant? And maybe Durden was telling us by that rabbit dying symbolically, which again, I wouldn't put it past a Broadway producer. But the answer is yes, she actually was pregnant. Thoughts? Do you believe Alex? Remember too, I mean, Dan calls the physician, right? So, and I want to know your interpretation of that phone call as well. Well, what does the physician tell Dan? Doesn't he call? Call them?
He says congratulations.
Yeah. Your thoughts, your interpretation?
And I believe it. I don't know, I don't have any reason not to.
So, I mean, I think, and I don't put any words in anyone's mouth. Maybe at first impression, there's no way we believe it, right? I mean, number one, we have the predisposing factor that she has borderline personality and is very manipulative. And then we have the actual precipitant, the very scene in front of us that shows that she only blurts it out when he rejects her the umpteenth time. It's almost as if she's desperate enough to say what she says. So first inclination, first impression, there's no way it could be true. But then we have that phone call, and then we have the rabbit dying. So maybe she is pregnant after all. Anybody else have any thoughts about this? I'll share my thoughts, probably off camera, about getting another alternative to that rabbit dying that nobody's thought of. Right, so just to tease it out there for a second, right? Any other thoughts about Alex, whether it's being pregnant, whether it's any additional features, signs or symptoms in addition to the stalking, the cruelty to animals?
Clarification. With the cruelty to animals, that kind of threw me, I guess, in terms of the borderline personality, because I know, I mean, that's characteristic of like the conduct disorder of a child, and then growing into antisocial personality. Would that be something that would, I guess, be outside of the normal actions for somebody with BPD? Or is it just related to how split she is on her attraction?
I think it's how desperate she is. So you're right, though. It's a textbook. It is much more consistent. Certainly on a shelf exam, that clinical vignette would be much more consistent with a single best answer of antisocial personality / conduct disorder, depending on the individual's age. But in the same context, watching this story unfold, watching this narrative, none of us really would be surprised that she got to that level of desperation. And she had this anger that was manifest the way it is. It goes from passive aggression now to acting out. And while acting out is considered to be the characteristic defense of antisocial personality, underlying those physical assaults that are defining of the illness, that doesn't mean we can't see acting out in lieu of passive aggression for borderline personality. That's exactly what happens here. Right, that initial defense gets overwhelmed, and now she has a secondary defense, and we see the unfortunate victim being that little bunny. Although there might be an alternative to it. Stalking, cruelty to animals, anything else that catches your eye with this character? I think there's obvious dysphoria, which shouldn't surprise anyone, chronic feelings of nothingness are part of the definition of borderline high comorbidity with major depression, as well as the depression anxiety clusters. So certainly within reason in terms of being medically accurate, evidence-based.
Too often people are touched with reality, like, Dan will tell her, logically, everyone should understand this, like, and she refuses to believe that, entertain the idea of that. And I think like increasingly as her attempts to reach him become more desperate, he tries to get her to see that what she's doing is beyond reason, but definitely doing that one.
Yeah, and justified. Yeah, and justified. Yeah. So there is a phenomenon in mental health in general referred to as stress-induced psychosis. And that's just a stress diathesis model where individuals with a particular predisposition, given the right amount of precipitant or stress, can demonstrate psychosis. So if that predisposing element were schizophrenia, you could envision that the level of stress to precipitate a psychotic episode would be minimal. Whereas an individual with no evidence of mental illness would require significant levels of stress to have a psychotic break. That's Donnie Darko, right? Then there's of course everything in between, right? We have someone with borderline personality disorder, and stress-induced psychosis is unfortunately somewhat common in individuals struggling with borderline personality. That level of predisposition doesn't require significant amounts of stress to precipitate a psychotic break. So I think we see that demonstrated here as well. What else?
And the scene I thought was kind of odd. And I don't know if it helps us understand her personality any better, but I thought it's odd. Is when she, I guess, kidnaps their daughter and takes her to like an amusement park and then just drops her off back at home later on after that. I don't know, I thought that was kind of odd because like you have this escalation of behaviors and like trying to get attention, and kidnapping a child, I would definitely call escalation and trying to get their attention. But then to have such like a pleasant day and drop the daughter off like without speaking to Dan, it kind of didn't really much know what was the intent behind the.
What was the, now again, if she were apprehended, likely going to jail, but not without a psychiatric evaluation, you are that evaluator, and this question comes up, what are your thoughts?
Want to put herself in the role, like she obviously had a fantasy life with Dan that she wanted to live, and it felt like she was, and that's, I don't know if this is where splitting kind of comes in, but like she sees it like she had a pleasant day with the girl because she was getting what she wanted, where she felt like she was becoming the surrogate like partner to Dan. So that was kind of how I took it, was she felt like a connection because it was his child.
Anybody ever see 1 Hour Photo? It's what the main character's side does to that family. By the way, if you haven't seen it, it's a great movie. It's arguably Robin Williams' best film. Now, I dare you to tell me what film is his best, because I will then tell you that 1 Hour Photo is better than the film you just named. Okay. So anyway, I digress. But yes, you're right. Very similar to, albeit another film, but yeah, she has inserted herself at least through fantasy in this family's life. She is daydreaming / fantasizing about being that mother, being that wife to Dan. And remember, she tells Dan that a doctor told her that she can't get pregnant. Right? We hear that. So this is Lady Macbeth. This is someone who can't become pregnant, who longs to be pregnant and is fantasizing about that. Right? In her mind, and perhaps this is handed down from her father, what is she worth if not to become a mom? What are you left with? And that's what she's struggling with, and that's why she inserts herself into this family the way she does. And depending on how far she goes into this, then she could enter into that fantasy world to a point where she does lose touch with reality, and that could be a psychotic break. So, and I don't know if that's what's going on there. But she was never going to harm Ellen. Just like Uncle Si is not going to harm that boy in 1 Hour Photo. All right. A lot going on here with the characters, some of which is explained by borderline personality, although there's a lot of other stuff going on, the stalking, the cruelty to animals, that we have to keep an eye on as well. Any final thoughts? We only have about 15 minutes left to tackle our second film, which is Gone Girl. So let's, keeping with the main character theme, focus on amazing Amy Dunn. So, thoughts?
Kind of like similar to one of the scenes where Catherine Howard, after everything that she's done to like her husband, when she comes back and disregards everything that just happened, and she just acts like everything is normal and doesn't even want to bring up anything embarrassing.
Yeah, so she is very premeditated to a point where that is the plot analysis. And then once discovered, just comes back into his life, her old life, with no remorse or any regret, and seemingly no anxiety about reassuming her former role, which lends a lot of people to ask the question, what just happened at the end of this movie? But we'll get to that maybe at some point. But I really want to tackle what's going on with Amy here. So what else have we picked up on this character?
I was most shocked by sort of the extremes that she went to in terms of the murder of her ex-boyfriend, whatever. It just seemed like it just kept getting more and more and more extreme as the plot continued. But to get to that point was really kind of like the sort of climax of the action, and then things, yeah, at the end we kind of going back to sort of the status quo where it began. Yeah, and like you said, so much happened, but then she kind of just reverts back to this normal character.
Mhm.
And I also was thinking a lot about like sort of how her parents writing these books about amazing Amy, when she was growing up, sort of how that might have affected her psychology and her sort of maybe like delusion that she has these sort of like superpowers to be able to like manipulate people, and like she's unstoppable, and sort of that kind of self-conception.
Well, let's talk about that. And I do want to provide just a brief remark about your observation, in that I completely agree with you. She is incredibly premeditated. And even when things don't work out as planned, like she was planning to commit suicide and frame her husband, and basically changed her mind, but never really gave, at least me, the impression that anything she was doing was out of desperation. She looked as calm and composed, even when she had to change plans midstream, than when she started this film, right? So, and we have to think of what that might be about. But then, unlike, I think, Fatal Attraction, unless I can do the deep dive and read the backstory, we have that backstory in some part anyway presented to us during the film, in terms of Amy's relationship with her parents. And you commented on that, and I think there's plenty of information for us to kind of investigate, with full disclosure and disclaimer that I am not a child psychiatrist. So with that out there, what do we know about Amy Dunn growing up?
If I'm remembering like what she said about her childhood and the books and how they kind of coincided, it sounded like the book, like Amazing Amy, was always like this perfect character. So like with the real Amy, like fail something, or maybe she quit some instrument or something, the like Amazing Amy book version of her excelled in every way, where she sometimes fell short. So then I guess in that sense, like having to compare herself in this way, like how her parents view her like shortcomings and publicize like the perfect version to the entire world, like how that would affect her mindset.
Yeah, and I think you're right. There's a couple of steps to this. Not only is this the idealized Amy, but it's the idealized Amy that's told to the world. Imagine how that 6 or 7-year-old probably felt when she learned of her parents' disappointment in that way. Right now, again, we're not told this. As a psychiatrist, we would definitely ask this, but my impression is that the parents did not go to Amy and say, by quitting the cello or the viola or whatever it was, it's okay. And then go ahead and publish. At least then the child has at least been reassured and therefore knows that the fictional character is different. I suggest that the parents never took that first step. I might be proven wrong. But it's certainly a question I would need to ask, and I would not be surprised if Amy and or other told us that, no, we never reassured her that whatever decision she made was okay, and we were supportive, despite the fact that we published what we published. So this is a child that grew up with a constant reminder of her parents' disappointment in her.
It's also interesting that sort of her diary, which is the narration throughout the film, and I read the book like many years ago when it first came out, is sort of, that's like the only truth, I suppose, to some extent, of what is actually going through her mind. And that's like the only window that we get into her actual actions. And then just to have that as a contrast with this fictionalized character that she was as a child, I think is really interesting.
So she's in psychotherapy with you, with us, with you. And that is brought up. Do you have any questions? Because I think it's completely accurate. So again, we're not going to tell the patient this. We're not going to be confrontative in any way. But I want to get to this idea of the use of, in this case, the diary as being the proverbial window to the soul. All right. And what I'm really getting at is, this, of course, in proper context means that I unfortunately can't always believe everything you say. Right. So with regard to the diary being the only true, the only truth behind what Amy is thinking, what questions might come up to kind of validate this or see how far it goes? Anyone?
I mean, I guess it's more like comparing like the narration versus what we see in actions on screen.
And we could, as an adult, Amy presents to us in psychotherapy, and we're hearing her bring up whatever it is she wants to talk about today, where we see some discrepancy between what is written in that diary, assuming she's sharing it with us. And now, as a therapist, we have knowledge of her inner thoughts and what she's willing to discuss in therapy. We might bring to light that there are some discrepancies. So that's true. What else? What other role might that diary have in terms of questioning for us and where we may go with our therapy? When in doubt in psychiatry, when we uncover something like this, always, always, always go back. Right? Do not assume that whatever behavior that has brought the individual to clinical attention operates in a vacuum and just started an hour before they actually entered that door. Always go back. The question to ask here is, it really seems that you've been very brave in putting your feelings into words in this diary. How long have you been keeping a diary? And when you had the trauma that you did as a child, did you journal back then? Because the fact that your journals today are your true self, how long back can we go that you have been true to yourself? Because if it did only happen over the past year, that's a little bit more telling than if this was happening since you were 6. Right? If you ask that question, what are some possible answers you may get from our patient?
I think one alternative, which I feel like is what the movie kind of prefers, is that she wrote in the journal and kind of fabricated the journal for her family. And she does say, in her like list of things, like a checklist of things that she needs to do, she says one journal, like at least minimum 300 entries dated, and then with like all the details. the alternative answer, if she were a different patient, would be, yes, I kept, these journals, and I was like documenting my trauma and they were like, already screaming, wasn't able to tell anybody else. Which
And again, would we really be shocked if that happened? Because what she's also telling us then is that my childhood was traumatic. Right now, 6-year-olds may not always take it upon themselves to think of, if I get this on paper, it might be helpful. 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. So how might she have actually gotten to the point where she began to journal that young?
Maybe she was like writing from imagining, like a fun fact or something.
Yeah, could be, right? Now, what we're also getting at and really focusing on what's going on when she was young is this idea that whatever it is that's going on in adult life is somehow related to that. Again, early childhood experiences do tend to relate to present day adult behavior. And if that adult behavior shapes up to be something that we would call antisocial personality, we know that those early childhood experiences must, by definition, amount to a condition called conduct disorder. So I'd be very interested to get an idea of what she's journaling. So, any other role that this journal may play in informing us about the plot of Gone Girl? And I don't mean the diary, I mean the journal when she was 9.
Like maybe just for sense of self, like if we're talking about like a borderline personality disorder, when she has a diagnosis, like I know a lot of people who are diagnosed with that just don't really have a sense of like who they are as individuals. So maybe just like getting a better understanding of sort of like what her baseline is.
Identity of self, yeah. I think that would be central to I definitely think. Because I mean, especially as children, and Erickson gets into this in terms of industry versus inferiority. But children will often define themselves through their accomplishments. Who am I? I'm the person that plays the cello, or am I the person that plays? So, and then there's multiple examples of that in this particular patient's life. So that's something I think that would be a primary interest. Who introduced journaling to a 8 or 9-year-old Amy? Again, and one answer could have been that she just, little girls tend to go through stores and say, I want this, and basically write a journal that's be fit for a novel. So you can't be surprised by her doing that, but there may have been another mechanism that resulted in her journaling when she was young.
Maybe the therapist told her that her mom was in doing it.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to ask, right? And then when you said what you just said out loud, did that resonate with anyone? Because boy, does it fit with the plot of this book. Not beyond speculation, I mean, something that we actually do know about Gone Girl, the book. I'm sorry, and the film. What do her parents do? Beside plagiarize and our authors.
The writers.
Besides that, what's their real job? They're both therapists. Right, so if you have mom and daddy Dunn sitting in front of you in an office discussing the case of Amazing Amy, and I don't mean a police office, I mean psychiatrist's office, and this idea of journaling does come up, and we hear that she always kept a journal. I can't look at another therapist's face and not ask, what's that about? Right. And then something Nick says reinforces this idea. I mean, one of the taglines to this movie is when he turns around to her and says, your parents literally plagiarized your childhood. What does that mean? I mean, he uses the word literally. What does it mean to have Dr. and Dr. Dunn literally plagiarize Amy's childhood?
Physically published an account of her childhood that is not real.
They published her journal. I mean, the tagline, and Nick says this. I mean, I don't think he understands what he says or the magnitude of what he's saying, but he says they literally plagiarized, meaning that there may have been material that they actually put to the publisher. And I wonder if that material was a child's journal in therapy. By the way, her parents not only are the authors that plagiarized, but they're also the therapists too. They had ready access to all of their daughter's most intimate thoughts growing up. And oh, by the way, children, and as part of therapy, often do idealize what it is, like some identity, sense of self that they would like to do. So we assume, and we might be correct, in that the parents see the quote unquote failures of their daughter, turn it around 180 and publish their idealized version of Amy. When this whole time it may have been Amy herself who is the one idealizing as part of therapy. Those notes literally being plagiarized into that amazing Amy series. So it's something for consideration. By going that route and having Amy in therapy in that backstory, and I've not read the book, right? So this is all speculation coming from the movie. This is something defining speculation that a therapist or a psychiatrist would ask, not necessarily in the initial eval, but certainly as part of psychotherapy to get to the root of what is going on in the adult character. Understanding that she may have been in therapy and her parents just happen to be therapists is something that cannot just be ignored. Other thoughts about this? What else would you want to know? She demonstrates a blatant disregard for and violation of others' rights. She has the cardinal feature of antisocial personality disorder. She meets clinical criteria for. You only need 3 criteria. I think we counted yesterday as 5. However, the one thing she does not have, because we don't know the prequel, is a history of conduct prior to the age of 50. So if you're going to build that prequel's coming out next year, and the producer director calls you and says, hey, we want you to help us as a consultant. What should we build into this prequel to allow for this to be a medically accurate film? What are you going to tell them? So number one, we already talked about the Amy's childhood, and in that childhood, let's get her a pet. Does she have a pet
Oh, yeah, yeah.
as an adult?
Yeah, as an adult.
Doesn't she make a comment about a pet though to Nick when she was younger?
She wanted a puppy, but then immediately we got the puppy and she didn't.
In retrospect, do you have a follow-up question to that? Yeah. Yeah, right. So in the prequel, let's just give her a puppy. We do not have to show a young Amy Dunn doing anything to that puppy. Let's give her a puppy, but all of a sudden, the report that we get in the original film now in proper context is misinformation. And now that brings up a whole another line of questioning is why did you provide that misinformation? Why did you lie? Because then we can put 2 and 2 together and realize that something probably did happen to that puppy, and we don't have to even show that. Right. What else do we want? What else do we want in this prequel?
Like not going to school or misbehaving in school.
Yeah, misbehaving in school, truancy, difficulty with authority figures. And anything else?
Maybe like when it comes to interactions with computers, like things that are going stuff too far all the time, like being cruel. I know like she blames an ex-boyfriend for the rape. Maybe there's like a very mild version of that in her childhood where she, a boy likes her or something, and she is cruel to him in some underhanded way.
That works. Absolutely works. Yeah. And the other one to think of is destruction of property in some way. Right. So basically what we're building is this idea that there are typical signs of conduct disorder that we would like established in an Amy Dunn prior to the age of 15 that would further validate the provisional diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder in the adult Amy, amazing Amy, in Gone Girl. Right? That's the primary idea. I think generally speaking, her home life should be one of discord. It should be deemed unsafe in some way. I don't think that mom and dad would be looked upon as role models in terms of adult behavior. And I don't think there's much to do with present day Miss Dr. and Dr. Dunn in terms of allowing for that. They're very cold and very distant. And that cold and distant parenting certainly could have occurred and probably did occur in childhood and probably then some. By the way, both have careers outside the house, so I'm wondering who was babysitting Amy during those times and what happened there. So all this would be proper development to support the original diagnosis of antisocial personality in Godwin. Any final thoughts? We're a little beyond 1 o'clock. All right, we're going to end it here. I will post on Twitter the film and the Seinfeld episode to prepare for next week.